Welcome to another episode of My Weird Prompts, an AI-generated podcast featuring the random prompts of Daniel Rosehill as answered by a revolving cast of friendly AI characters. Join us for deep dives into AI, technology, and whatever other random thing Daniel finds fascinating today. Subscribe on Spotify or your favorite podcatcher. Now, today's episode.
This episode was generated using artificial intelligence. Please verify facts.
Hey there, Herman and Corn. So in the spirit of asking about, all kinds of random questions, I thought I'd ask you guys one that has crossed my mind whenever I go flying, traveling internationally, which these days is less than I did back in the day. I have to say, I really don't miss it. I feel like international aviation, for those of us chumps who can't afford, first class tickets or aren't being paid from business class, it's become a progressively less pleasant experience. And so, as much as sometimes we talked about some of my trips on my to see list, Japan and Costa Rica, probably at the top of that, I'm inclined now to spend, or my ideal trips are kind of spending more time in a place and minimizing the time traveling because it's just become so unpleasant. But one thing that I wonder every time I go traveling is the following, and I thought I'd get your erudite input here. So when we go to an airport and we check in our bags for flight, we have a baggage allowance, and we see that the person at the check-in counter is weighing up our baggage. And one of the first things you learn when you're in private aviation, I did a few lessons back in the day, is weight and balance, very important to an airplane. And you can understand, I guess we talked in a previous episode about the invisible people that make commercial aviation work. And one of the most interesting, I think, being the flight dispatcher, who does a lot of the weight and balance calculations and approvals to make sure that there's enough runway, and all this stuff is calculated to a huge amount of accuracy. So that really even the thrust that the pilots use for takeoff is, if I'm not mistaken, actually the set point is prepared on the balance of how much they're carrying, because you don't want to use too much thrust. It's harder on the engines. But one thing that isn't going into those calculations for major commercial flights is the weight of the passengers. In addition to the bags, the airplane is moving a bunch of people, and it's also not considering carry-on luggage, as far as I know. I'm saying on your average flight, where you don't get checked, or they don't weigh the bags individually. I think it's the budget airlines are kind of looking for doing compliance checks, but the major carriers on international often just don't. No one gets checked, and they just kind of hope that you've got, or they trust that you've got stuff within the limit. But of course, as carriers are getting stricter about baggage limits, you're seeing people get more and more thrifty and hacky in terms of finding ways to fit more and more stuff, either on their carry-on or even on their person. There's some kind of funny videos on Instagram of people rocking up to an airport in fishing jackets because they can cram a lot of stuff into the pockets. Now, all I'm asking is regarding the weight and balance calculations. It seems like there's two things that we're really missing here. One is the passengers, and the other one is the load that goes into the overhead bins, which can really be a very substantial amount of weight. Like when you see how much stuff is crammed up there, that's a lot of mass that the airline has to move. So my question is this: obviously the people in charge of these airlines know what they're doing. We don't hear about, God forbid, stuff going horribly wrong because the weight and balance calcs were vastly off because of carry-on luggage. But I've heard that there are some interesting ways that airlines use to get an estimate for the average passenger weight. How does it all work out safely in the end when the crew doesn't know exactly how much mass they're moving across the sky? Herman and Corn, let's talk about weight and balance in commercial aviation. Over to you.
Hey everyone, welcome back to My Weird Prompts. I'm Corn, and I'm joined as always by my brother, the man who probably knows the exact weight of every book in our house, Herman Poppleberry, at your service. And for the record, Corn, it is not just the books. I have a very good estimate for the furniture as well. It helps with the floor load capacity. You never know when a heavy delivery might exceed the structural limits of a 1920s joist system. Of course you do. Well, today we are diving into a topic that our housemate Daniel sent over. He was telling us about how much he misses the golden age of travel, even though he is still checking off his bucket list, like Japan and Costa Rica. But he pointed out something that everyone who has ever stood in a check-in line has probably wondered. Why do they obsessively weigh your suitcase down to the last gram, but then they just let you walk onto the plane without a second glance?
It is a classic aviation paradox, right? You are sweating over whether your extra pair of shoes will put you over the 50-pound limit, while the person next to you might weigh 100 pounds more than you do, and the airline treats you both as identical units of mass. It feels personal, but it is actually a very elegant solution to a massive logistical problem.
Exactly. Daniel mentioned those viral videos of people wearing 20 layers of clothes or fishing jackets with 50 pockets just to avoid baggage fees. If people are hacking the system like that, how does the pilot actually know if the plane is safe to take off? How do they calculate weight and balance when so much of the cargo is essentially a mystery? I mean, we are sitting here in January of 2026, and we have self-driving cars and AI that can write poetry. But we are still guessing how much the passengers weigh.
This is such a fascinating deep dive because it combines physics, statistics, and some very clever engineering. We have touched on the infrastructure side of things before, like back in episode 287 when we talked about the networking at John F. Kennedy International Airport, but this is about the literal physics of getting those massive metal tubes into the air. To understand why we do not weigh people, we first have to understand what happens if we get the weight wrong.
So, let's start with the why. I think most people understand that a plane can't be too heavy, but weight and balance is about more than just the total number on the scale, right?
Right. It is not just about the weight, it is about the distribution. In aviation, we talk about the center of gravity, or CG. Think of the airplane like a giant seesaw. The pivot point is the center of lift on the wings. If you put too much weight in the back, the nose wants to pitch up. If you put too much in the front, the nose wants to stay glued to the runway. Every aircraft has a very specific envelope, a range where that center of gravity must stay for the plane to be controllable. We measure this in something called the mean aerodynamic chord, or MAC. If your center of gravity is at 25% MAC, you are usually in the sweet spot.
And that is why the flight dispatcher is such a critical role. We mentioned them briefly in our episode about the invisible people of aviation. They are the ones doing the math before the pilots even step onto the flight deck. They are looking at the load manifest and deciding where everything goes.
Exactly. And the math starts with what we call the operating empty weight. This is the weight of the airplane itself, plus the crew, the fluids like hydraulic oil and engine oil, and all the fixed equipment like the seats and the galleys. That is a known, measured constant. Then you add the fuel, which is very precisely measured because fuel is expensive and heavy. 1 gallon of jet fuel weighs about 6.7 pounds, or roughly 3 kilograms per 4 liters. On a big long-haul flight, the fuel alone can weigh over 300,000 pounds.
Okay, so the plane and the fuel are the easy parts. But then you add 300 humans, their carry-on bags, their checked luggage, and maybe a few tons of commercial cargo in the belly. That is where it gets fuzzy. How do you turn a crowd of people into a single reliable number for a flight computer?
This is where the power of the law of large numbers comes in. Airlines do not weigh every person because, statistically, they do not have to. Instead, they use what are called standard weights. These are averages determined by aviation authorities like the Federal Aviation Administration in the United States or the European Union Aviation Safety Agency. In the US, the current guidelines come from Advisory Circular 120-27F.
Standard weights. So they basically just assume I weigh a certain amount. What is the current average human, according to the government?
Well, it is actually quite detailed. As of the most recent updates that went into full effect over the last few years, a standard adult male in the summer is estimated at 200 pounds. In the winter, that number jumps to 205 pounds to account for heavy coats and boots. For women, the summer weight is around 179 pounds, and the winter weight is 184. And here is the kicker. Those numbers include their carry-on bag and personal item, which are estimated at 16 pounds combined.
Wait, 16 pounds for a carry-on? I have definitely seen people lugging personal items that weigh 40 pounds. And 5 pounds for a coat? That seems like a lot. But I guess across 200 people, it adds up. But here's the thing, Herman. People are getting heavier. I mean, health trends over the last few decades show that the average weight of a person in 2026 is significantly higher than it was in 1970s. Do the airlines just ignore that?
Not at all. In fact, those standard weights are updated periodically. Every few years, the regulators conduct surveys. They literally go to gates and ask passengers to step on scales voluntarily to get a new snapshot of the population. You might remember back in 2023 and 2024, airlines like Air New Zealand and Finnair made headlines for doing exactly this. They set up scales at the gate and asked for volunteers. They even offered small incentives like a bowl of candy or a small voucher just to get people to step on the scale.
I remember that. People were worried about privacy and body shaming. It was a whole thing on social media. But the airlines were adamant that the data was anonymous, right?
Completely anonymous. The gate agent sees a number, it goes into a database, and it is never linked to your name or your seat number. The goal is purely to see if the standard weight of 190 or 200 pounds is still accurate for that specific route. For example, a flight from a ski resort in January is going to have a much higher average passenger weight than a flight from a tropical beach in July. The regulators use these surveys to adjust the math for the entire industry.
But what about the outliers? What if you have a flight that is somehow entirely composed of a professional rugby team, or a convention of people who love those fishing jackets Daniel mentioned? Doesn't the average break down when the sample size is skewed?
You hit on a great point. The standard weights rely on a random distribution. If you have a group booking, like a sports team, a military charter, or even a large high school band, the airline is actually required to use more accurate data. They might use a different set of averages for those groups, or in some cases, they might actually ask for individual weights. If you are flying a team of offensive linemen, the dispatcher is definitely not going to use the standard 190-pound average. They will likely add a significant buffer or ask the team manager for a roster with weights.
It is basically a giant game of statistical insurance. But I want to go back to the checked bags for a second. They weigh those very carefully. Is that because the cargo hold is more sensitive to weight than the cabin?
It is actually a bit of both. First, checked bags are easier to weigh. The scale is already there at the counter. But more importantly, the checked bags and the commercial cargo are what the ground crew uses to fine-tune the center of gravity. Remember the seesaw? If the passenger cabin is full and the computer calculates that the center of gravity is too far forward, the loaders will purposely put the heaviest suitcases and the cargo pallets in the rear cargo hold to pull that balance back toward the center. They use these things called unit load devices, or ULDs. Those are the big silver containers you see being driven around the tarmac. Each one is weighed and assigned a specific position in the plane's belly.
So the check bags are like the counterweights on a crane. If you do not know exactly what they weigh, you cannot balance the load.
That is a perfect analogy. The pilots receive a document called a load sheet before they take off. It used to be a piece of paper handed through the cockpit window, but now it is almost always digital, sent to their electronic flight bag, or EFB, which is just a fancy name for their tablet. It tells them the total weight, the distribution, and most importantly, the trim setting. The trim is basically a small adjustment to the tail of the plane that helps it stay level without the pilot having to constantly pull or push on the controls. If the load sheet says the plane is tail heavy, the pilot sets the trim to compensate. If that load sheet is wrong, the pilot might try to take off and find that the nose is much heavier than expected, which is very dangerous.
I remember reading about a few accidents where the weight and balance were the primary cause. There was a cargo flight in the early 2000s where the load shifted during takeoff. That was a terrifying video.
You are thinking of National Airlines Flight 102 in Bagram in 2013. That was a tragic case where a massive armored vehicle in the cargo hold wasn't properly secured. During the steep climb after takeoff, the vehicle broke loose and slid to the very back of the plane. It shifted the center of gravity so far aft that the plane stalled and the pilots couldn't recover. But there is another famous case that actually changed how we look at passenger weights, Air Midwest Flight 5481 in Charlotte, back in 2003.
I haven't heard of that one. What happened there?
It was a small commuter plane, a Beechcraft 1900D. It crashed shortly after takeoff because it was overweight and the center of gravity was too far aft. The investigation found that the airline was using standard weights from the 1990s that were way too low. They assumed the average passenger weighed about 20 pounds less than they actually did. When you have a small plane with only 19 seats, those 20 pounds per person add up to a huge percentage of the total mass. That crash was a major reason why the FAA started being much more aggressive about updating these averages.
So we have standard weights for people and carry-ons, and exact weights for checked bags and fuel. But what about the actual plane itself? I mean, we are in 2026 now. Is there no way for the plane to just know how heavy it is? Like a smart scale built into the wheels?
There actually is. This is one of the cooler pieces of tech that is becoming more common on newer aircraft, though it is not as universal as you might think. Many modern planes are equipped with sensors in the landing gear, specifically in the oleo struts, which are the shock absorbers for the wheels. As the weight of the plane increases, the pressure in those struts increases. The onboard computer can translate that pressure into a very accurate measurement of the total weight and the center of gravity. We call this an onboard weight and balance system, or OWBS.
That seems like it would solve the whole problem. Why don't we just use that and stop guessing with averages? It seems so much safer.
Well, as with everything in aviation, it comes down to redundancy and cost. Those sensors can fail, they can get out of calibration, or they can be affected by the slope of the runway or even a strong wind pushing on the tail. Most airlines still prefer to use the calculated weight from the load sheet as their primary source because it is based on verified data from the gate and the cargo hold. They use the landing gear sensors as a cross-check. If the computer says the plane weighs 200,000 pounds based on the struts, but the load sheet says it should be 190,000, that triggers an immediate investigation before the wheels leave the ground. It is that classic belt and...
I like that. It is better to have two different ways of being right, but I'm curious about the second-order effects here. If we are using averages, and those averages are slightly off, that must have a huge impact on fuel efficiency over time. If you think you are lighter than you are, you might not bring enough fuel.
Oh, it is massive. Fuel is the single biggest expense for an airline. If a plane is even 1% heavier than the pilots think it is, they are going to burn more fuel than they planned for. On a long-haul flight, that might mean they arrive with less of a safety margin than they'd like. On the flip side, if the pilots think the plane is heavier than it actually is, they might use more engine thrust than necessary for takeoff, which increases wear and tear on the engines and wastes fuel. In 2025, we saw a lot of research into using AI to predict passenger weights based on booking data and historical trends to try and shave off even more of that uncertainty.
Daniel mentioned that he noticed airlines are getting stricter about carry-on limits. Is that purely about making money from fees, or is there a weight and balance reason for that too? Because it feels like they're just being mean sometimes.
It is a bit of both, but there is a real safety element. Over the last decade, as checked bag fees went up, people started cramming more and more into their carry-ons. We have all seen those bags that look like they are about to explode. If everyone on a 200-seat plane brings an extra 10 pounds of carry-on that isn't accounted for in the standard average, you have suddenly added an extra ton of unmanifested weight to the cabin. That is not trivial. And it is all concentrated in the overhead bins, which are high up.
Does that affect the stability? Like, does it make the plane top-heavy?
It raises the center of gravity vertically, which can make the plane feel a bit more rolly, or sensitive in turns, though usually not to a dangerous degree. The bigger concern is the structural limit of the bins themselves and the impact on takeoff performance. If the pilot thinks the plane weighs 150,000 pounds, but it actually weighs 152,000, their calculated takeoff speed, or V-speed, will be slightly too low. They might try to lift the nose before the wings have enough lift to support the actual weight.
That is a scary thought. I saw a news story recently about an airline in New Zealand that was weighing passengers as they boarded. There was a lot of pushback about privacy and body shaming. It is a sensitive topic, but from a purely engineering standpoint, I guess you can see why they want that data. They just want the math to be perfect.
Exactly. Engineers love certainties. If I could give a flight computer the exact mass and position of every single object on the plane, the flight would be more efficient and safer. But we live in a world with social norms and privacy concerns. Using statistical averages is the compromise that allows the system to function without making the airport experience even more invasive than it already is. We are basically trading a tiny bit of precision for a lot of human dignity.
It's interesting to think about how this changes as we move toward more sustainable aviation. We talked about electric planes and alternative fuels in past episodes. I imagine weight is even more critical when you are dealing with batteries, right? Because they do not get lighter as you fly.
Oh, absolutely. This is the biggest challenge for electric aviation in 2026. In a traditional jet, the plane actually gets lighter as it flies because it is burning off fuel. Sometimes a plane is actually too heavy to land safely right after takeoff, so if there is an emergency, they have to dump fuel to get the weight down. With an electric plane, the batteries weigh the same at the end of the flight as they did at the beginning. That changes the entire calculation for landing gear stress and approach speeds. Every pound counts even more there because you cannot burn off your mistakes.
So, for the average traveler like Daniel, when he sees someone wearing a fishing jacket full of heavy electronics, he shouldn't necessarily worry that the plane is going to fall out of the sky. The system is designed with enough of a buffer to handle a few outliers.
Right. There is a safety buffer built into almost every calculation in aviation. The maximum takeoff weight isn't the point where the wings snap off, it is the point where the plane can still safely climb even if one engine fails. There is a lot of margin there. But, as a rule, the more people try to hack the system by hiding weight, the more the airlines and regulators will be forced to increase the standard averages, which eventually leads to higher fuel surcharges for everyone. It is a tragedy of the commons, but with luggage.
So by trying to save $20 on a bag fee, you might be contributing to a world where everyone's ticket gets more expensive because the average weight has to be bumped up. That is a classic hidden cost. I think that is a perfect place to take a quick break. When we come back, I want to talk about some of the more unusual things that get weighed on a plane. I have heard stories about everything from prize-winning bulls to gold bars being transported in the hold. How do you balance a plane when your cargo is literally a ton of living, breathing animal that might decide to walk around?
Oh, that is a great one. The live animal variable adds a whole new layer of complexity because, unlike a suitcase, a bull can move. And when the weight moves, the center of gravity moves with it. We will get into the moving mass problem right after this.
We will be right back. AD break. And we are back. Herman, before the break you teased the idea of moving mass. I am still picturing a literal bull in a china shop, except the shop is a Boeing 747 at 30,000 feet. How do pilots handle cargo that has a mind of its own?
It is actually a very common occurrence. We call it AVIH, or animal vivant in hold. If you are transporting something like a horse or a large animal, they are kept in specialized stalls that limit their movement, but you still have to account for the fact that the weight might shift a few inches forward or backward. On a giant plane, a single horse moving isn't going to do much. But if you are flying a dedicated horse charter with 30 or 40 animals, their collective movement can actually be felt in the flight controls.
Wait, the pilots can actually feel the horses moving? That is wild.
They can. There have been reports from cargo pilots where they can feel a slight thump or a change in the trim requirement if a group of animals all shifts at once. There is actually a special code in the cargo manifest that tells the pilot to be aware of potential center of gravity fluctuations. And it is not just animals. Even passengers moving to the back of the plane to wait for the bathroom can shift the center of gravity. On a small regional jet, if 10 people all stand up at once and walk to the back, the pilot might have to adjust the trim to keep the nose from rising.
That reminds me of those small puddle jumper flights where the flight attendant asks people to change seats before takeoff. I always thought they were just trying to be organized, but they are literally balancing the seesaw.
Exactly. On a plane like a Saab 34B or a Beechcraft, the margin for error is much smaller. If everyone sits in the back, the plane might be impossible to rotate safely. I have even seen cases where they put sandbags in the front cargo hold of an empty regional jet just to keep the nose down while it is parked at the gate. If they don't, and everyone walks to the back to get off the plane could actually tip over onto its tail. We call that a tail tip, and it is a very expensive mistake.
I have seen photos of that. A big jet just sitting on its butt with the nose gear in the air. It looks like a giant dog begging for a treat. But let's talk about the new tech. You mentioned the Airbus A321XLR earlier. I heard that plane had some unique weight and balance challenges because of its extra fuel tank.
You have been doing your homework. The A321XLR, which started flying long-haul routes recently, has a massive rear center tank, or RCT. It is built into the structure of the plane behind the wings. Because that tank is so far back, when it is full of fuel, it shifts the center of gravity significantly toward the tail. Airbus had to do a lot of clever engineering to make sure the plane stayed stable as that fuel was burned off. They even had to add extra fireproofing and structural reinforcement, which added about 800 kilograms of extra weight. That is the equivalent of about 9 or 10 extra passengers just in safety weight.
800 kilograms just to keep the tank safe? That is a huge penalty. It shows you how much effort goes into these calculations. So, to answer Daniel's question, the reason they don't weigh him is that he is part of a very well-studied statistical model. The airline knows that 300 humans will, 99% of the time, fall within a certain weight range. And for the 1% of the time they don't, the plane has enough extra power and structural strength to handle it.
Spot on. The mystery of the passenger weight is managed through the science of probability. But the certainty of the checked bags and the fuel provides the anchor for the whole calculation. It is a blend of hard data and smart estimation. It is what allows us to fly millions of people every day without having to put a scale at every single gate.
I feel a lot better about my next flight now. Even if I do see someone wearing 3 coats and a fishing jacket, I'll know that the oleo struts and the flight dispatcher have it under control. It is all part of the margin.
Just maybe don't sit right next to the guy in the fishing jacket. He might be a bit cramped, and that is a different kind of weight and balance issue.
Good point. Well, this has been a really enlightening dive into the physics of flight. It is one of those things we take for granted every time we board, but there is so much hidden math happening behind the scenes. It really makes you appreciate the complexity of the industry.
It really is a testament to human engineering. We have taken something as chaotic as a few hundred people and turned it into a predictable, manageable system of mass and balance. It is beautiful, in a nerdy, mathematical sort of way.
And hey, if you are listening and you have ever been part of one of those random weigh-ins at the airport, we want to hear about it. Was it awkward? Did they give you a voucher for a free sandwich or a bowl of candy like Air New Zealand? You can get in touch with us through the contact form at myweirdprompts.com.
And while you are there, you can check out all our past episodes. We have a whole archive of deep dives into everything from ISO country codes to the hidden history of sloth tourism, which we covered in episode 280. We even talked about the weight of voice note automation in episode 65, which has some surprising parallels to what we discussed today.
And if you are enjoying the show, please do us a huge favor and leave a review on your podcast app or on Spotify. It really does help other curious people find us. We are a small, independent show, and every rating makes a difference in our own weight and balance of the podcast charts.
It really does. Thanks for joining us today, and thanks to Daniel for the great prompt. It is always fun to geek out on the stuff that makes the world work.
Absolutely. Until next time, I am Corn.
And I am Herman Poppleberry.
This has been my Weird Prompts. Keep asking those questions, no matter how weird they are.
We will see you next week.
Bye, everyone.
Take care.
This episode was generated using Gemini Flash 3. Text-to-speech engine was Chatterbox Turbo.
Thanks for listening to another episode of My Weird Prompts, an AI-generated podcast featuring Daniel Rosehill's AI prompts as answered by a revolving cast of friendly AI characters including me, Cornelius the Sloth. Subscribe on Spotify or visit myweirdprompts.com.